Let me introduce Dr. Uroš Matić, who is a senior fellow at the College for Social Sciences and Humanities, Ruhr University Alliance in Essen, Germany. He specializes in war and violence in ancient Egypt, as well as settlement and gender archaeology. He obtained his PhD in 2017 from the Institute for Egyptology and Coptic Studies at the University of Münster, Germany. He is currently conducting the project Space of Fear, an approach to intimidation in New Kingdom Egyptian palaces, also in Essen. Previously, he was an assistant professor at the Institute for Ancient History and Ancient Near Eastern Studies at the University of Innsbruck, and a lecturer at the Institute of Classical Studies at the University of Graz. He has also lectured at the Universities of Vienna and Münster and worked for the Austrian Archaeological Institute of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. Dr. Matić has extensive fieldwork experience in Egyptian settlement archaeology, including work at sites such as Tel El Daba, Aswan, and Kom Please, let's give a warm New York welcome to Uroš Matić.
Anyhow, I want to stress there will be no violence tonight and no topics such as war and violence. I will be dealing with streets. And yes, so dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, dear guests, I would like to first express my deep gratitude to both Anthony Bello and John Fried and the entire ARCE New York chapter for having me at the Salmagundi Club. Also thanks to our host at the Salmagundi Club for allowing me to speak here tonight. And as you can see from this first slide, my lecture today focuses on ancient Egyptian streets. So to begin, I would like to provide an overview of the topics I will be discussing with you tonight. First, I will introduce the ways in which we can explore ancient Egyptian streets and how this has been approached by Egyptologists in the past or so far. Additionally, I will compare these approaches to ancient Egyptian streets to studies of streets in other ancient cultures, such as, for example, ancient Rome. Since Egyptologists benefit greatly from the abundance of textual sources from ancient Egypt, I will then focus on activities that took place on ancient Egyptian streets as attested in textual records, and these coming from different periods of ancient Egyptian history. So there will be no focus on one particular period of ancient Egyptian history. These activities include shaving, wandering around, gossiping, and even sex work. So following the analysis of textual sources, I will turn to the archaeological evidence uncovered during excavations of ancient Egyptian streets. Here, my goal will be to demonstrate that archaeology can reveal activities that are not mentioned in ancient texts. Additionally, I will then discuss how some activities recorded in textual sources leave little or no archaeological evidence whatsoever. To further illuminate the range of potential street activities, I will also draw on ethnographic studies of contemporary rural Egypt. Finally, I will conclude with some reflections and prospects for future research. So, since its emergence in the early 19th century, Egyptology as a discipline has heavily relied on textual sources to reconstruct ancient Egyptian culture. This branch of Egyptology, often referred to as ancient Egyptian philology, focuses on the understanding of various phases of ancient Egyptian language and how this knowledge can be used to accurately interpret and translate ancient texts. As I will demonstrate in this lecture, the study of street activities provides a clear example of the strength and limitations of the textual sources. As I said previously, some activities are explicitly mentioned in ancient Egyptian texts, while others are absent. Since the ancient Egyptians did not record every aspect of their lives, and may not have considered certain topics of textual documentation, Egyptologists also turn to visual evidence, representations of daily life and the afterlife. However, streets are rarely depicted as distinct and recognizable space in these images, or they are impossible to recognize there without these images having accompanying text stating that these are streets. Therefore, this brings us to a relatively neglected aspect of Egyptological research, and that is archaeology. So archaeological research in Egypt has traditionally focused on temples and tombs, particularly royal and elite burials. However, over the past few decades, archaeologists have increasingly turned their attention to ancient Egyptian settlements. Excavations at sites such as Tel el-Daba, Lahun, Tel el-Amarna, Edfu, Komombo, and Elephantine, among others, have significantly enhanced our understanding of ancient Egyptian urbanism. As a result, the long-standing notion that ancient Egypt was a civilization without cities no longer holds the weight of evidence. Most research on ancient Egyptian settlements has focused either on publishing extensive excavation reports or on studying domestic spaces such as palaces and houses. Unfortunately, the streets running between these houses have received far less scholarly attention. In contrast, settlement and urban archaeology in other fields, particularly in ancient Roman studies and archaeology, have a much longer tradition. Ancient Roman streets, for instance, have been examined through the lenses of philology, art history, and archaeology, offering valuable theoretical and methodological approaches that could greatly inspire Egyptologists in the future. One such example is Jeremy Harnett's monograph, The Roman Street, from 2017, which has a major influence also on my own work and research, especially concerning the focus on social activities which took place in ancient Egyptian streets. So I would like to begin by analyzing textual sources that provide insights into the life and activities that took place on the streets. As I will demonstrate, contrary to the opinions of some archaeologists, ancient Egyptian texts suggest that streets in ancient Egyptian settlements were more than just a transitional space. They were active, lived-in environments. So, just like in ancient Rome, activities such as shaving took place on the streets of ancient Egypt. We are well informed about this practice from the teaching of Heti, a classic of ancient Egyptian literature that discusses various occupations and is therefore also known as the Satire of Trades. The text is preserved in several copies dating to the New Kingdom. However, the composition itself is written in Middle Egyptian, suggesting that it likely originated in the Middle Kingdom, possibly in the early 12th dynasty, so this is approximately 1950 to 1900s BCE. In describing the barber's occupation, Heti tells his son Pepi that barbers move from street to street in search of clients to shave. In one copy, it is even specified that this occurs at midday. In fact, there seems to be a word play here, since the word used for street was mereret in ancient Egyptian, and one for the midday is meteret. This also raises the question of whether barbers entered houses or performed their work outdoors in the sunlight. If shaving took place outside, it is plausible that barbers operated in the shade of a canopy made from textile, reeds, or other light, perishable materials which do not leave traces in the archaeological record, at least not all the time. As seen in the tomb of the 18th dynasty official Usenhat in Thebes, you can see here on the left of the slide, depict soldiers being shaved outdoors. However, it is unclear whether the location is a street or not. Interestingly, as you can see here, the soldiers are seated under a tree, which likely provided shade. Another activity that took place on the streets of ancient Egypt was roaming around or wandering. In fact, this behavior is criticized in textual sources. Both Papyrus Sallier I and Anastasia IV, housed in the British Museum in London, date to the Ramesside period and mention the act of going from street to street. Several centuries later, the famous instructions of Anshishon, preserved on Papyrus British Museum EA-1058, state that children of the fool wander in the street, while those of the wise man remain beside him. I dare to say that such attitudes towards street life seem to transcend space and time, as my own parents expressed similar views when I was a child. They disapproved of the expressions one could pick up on the streets and judged those who spent too much time there, telling and retelling stories they deemed unsuitable for children. Now, the culture of gossiping is also attested in ancient Egypt. In the instructions of Amenemhat to his son Senusret, a composition dating to the 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom, it is stated that there is much hatred in the streets. The text was copied into New Kingdom, and it's preserved on Papyrus Willingen, as well as some wooden tablets in Ostraka. The same statement is repeated in the instructions of Amenhotep, coming from the Ramesside period, likely 11th century BC. So we have a long tradition of gossiping as a theme in this text. This text was also copied on several papyri, Ostraka tablets, well into the late period, namely to the 6th century BCE. So you can see that the same topics were kind of important concerning streets for centuries. They had a long duration of importance. So one of the activities that took place on the streets of ancient Egypt was also sex work, meaning that sex workers could be found in these public spaces. The instructions of Anshishon, already mentioned, stated, "The one who loves the woman of the street has his purse split open." This statement could imply several things, so it's hypothetical. First, that distraction could lead to financial loss. Second, that women working on the streets as sex workers may have collaborated with thieves. In the first demotic tale of Setne, preserved on Papyrus Egyptian Museum CG 3646, the daughter of the priest of Bastet, Tabubu, rejects Setne's suggestion to spend an hour with him in exchange for 10 pieces of gold or the settlement of any of her wrongdoings. Insulted, Tabubu sends a message to her maidservant, telling Setne that if he wishes to be with her, he must come to her house in Bubastis, where no one will see her, and she will not be behaving like a low woman in the street. The fact that Setne offered money or services for sex, and that Tabubu explicitly rejected making such arrangements in public, suggests that the phrase "low woman of the street" refers to a sex worker. Further evidence that sexual activity could take place on the streets, or at least that such an idea could be used to ridicule someone, comes from a Ptolemaic graffito in Greek at Karnak Temple. This inscription mocks a man named Ptolemaeus, son of Abdes, by stating that he was buggered in the street. Centuries later, in the Discourse to the Alexandrians, Dio Chrysostom remarks that while sex workers might behave properly inside a house, they should also conduct themselves in an orderly manner outside on the streets. However, he notes that it is in the streets, exactly there, where they most frequently engage in misconduct. So last but not least, A well-known textual source from outside Egypt presents ancient Egyptian life as a kind of a topsy-turvy world. This account appears in the History of Herodotus, written in 5th century BCE by this Greek poet and historian. Herodotus claims that, unlike other peoples, Egyptians relieve themselves indoors but eat in the streets. Here, he deliberately inverts the expected places for these activities, a pattern seen in many of his other descriptions that portray Egypt as radically different from his own homeland. However, like many of Herodotus' claims and curious observations, often doubted by modern scholars, this one too may contain a grain of truth. As I will demonstrate next, in the continuation of this lecture, archaeological evidence from ancient Egyptian settlements suggests that communal cooking and possibly even eating in the streets did take place. So next I would like to take a closer look at the archaeological record of the streets in several ancient Egyptian settlements. Due to time constraints, I am unable to present all of the available evidence. Instead, I will focus on a selection of sites where I have personally worked as a member of the field archaeological team, or those sites where the documentation allows us to study streets concerning social activities which took place on them. All of the following examples come from so-called organically grown settlements. Settlements that developed spontaneously in favorable locations. The first site I would like to focus on is Tel el-Daba, or ancient ARCE. This site is located approximately 140 kilometers northeast of Cairo. I marked it here with an arrow, in the eastern delta of Lower Egypt. The earliest excavations date back to 1885, when the French Egyptologist Edouard Nabil first worked at the site. Egyptian Egyptologist Abu Ghalib conducted excavations there from 1941 to 42, followed by Shahata Adam, who led the excavations from 1951 to 1954. And since 1966, the site has been systematically excavated by the Austrian Archaeological Institute of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, first by Manfred Witag since 1966 onwards until 2009, when the directorship of the project was taken over by Irene Forsten-Müller. I myself joined the Tel el-Daba team from 2012 to 2016, first as an MA and then as a PhD student. So decades of archaeological research at the site have allowed for a detailed reconstruction of its landscape, history and organization. Tel el-Daba was first settled during the early Middle Kingdom as a planned settlement and state project in area F1. The original settlement quickly expanded into other parts of the site, such as Esbedrujli. By the late Middle Kingdom, the first evidence of settlers from the Levant appears. These settlers spoke a West Semitic language, dressed differently from ancient Egyptians, and used distinct types of pottery, for example. Recently, Manfred Witag's team confirmed the Levantine origins of some of this population through stable isotope analysis. As Egyptians and Levantines lived together, they gradually exchanged customs, leading to the development of a distinct Eastern Delta material culture, particularly evident in pottery production. Now, sometimes during the late Middle Kingdom, the Egyptian state lost control of Eastern Delta and eventually of the entire Lower Egypt. In the following period, known as the Second Intermediate Period, Tel el-Daba became the capital of a kingdom referred to in historiography as the Kingdom of the Hyksos. Scholars continue to debate whether these kings were local or having foreign descent or actual immigrants from the Levant. So far, no burials of these kings have been discovered. During their reign, Tel el-Daba became one of the largest Bronze Age cities in the Eastern Mediterranean. The city featured multiple harbors and mooring places, facilitating trade and military activities. The Hyksos kings extended their control into the Middle Egypt, posing a significant threat to the rival Theban kingdom in the south, with its capital at Thebes. And then around 1550 BCE, at the end of the Second Intermediate Period, the Theban kings successfully conquered the Hyksos kingdom, unifying Egypt. However, Tel el-Daba did not lose its significance in the following new kingdom. Instead, it became an important strategic base for organizing military campaigns in the Levant. During the Ramesside period, the site became a peripheral area of the new capital, Pyramezes, which was located in Khantia, just north of Tel el-Daba. And in the following Third Intermediate Period, both Khantia and Tel el-Daba lost their significance as political power, shifted to Tanis, San el-Haga, the new capital of Lower Egypt. In the subsequent late period and the Ptolemaic and Roman era, Tel el-Daba became one of many smaller towns in the eastern delta, no longer playing a central role in Egypt's political or military affairs. So after this rather extensive overview of Tel el-Daba's history, let's move to the first case study of my lecture concerning streets. So to illustrate what one might have encountered on ancient Egyptian streets, particularly those of Tel el-Daba, I will focus on one of the best excavated settlement areas of this site so far, and this is Espet Urushdi 3. This area was excavated between 2010 until 2012 under the directorship of Irene Forstenmüller, and on the site map it is located here where this red circle is placed. So Espet Urushdi covered a surface of around 2,400 square meters, which is approximately 2,900 square yards, and functioned as a town quarter during the Second Intermediate Period under the reign of the previously mentioned Hyksos kings of the 15th dynasty. This settlement area was both administrative and residential district, not far from one of the city harbors located here. So again, as a whole, as a capital, and the area we are concerned is here, just next to the main harbor of the site. So the excavated area showed the existence of three complexes of mud brick buildings divided by two long streets which were approximately 3.2 meters wide and ran southwest to northeast. So you can see these streets here dividing the three complexes, Complex 1, Complex 2, and Complex 3. So the streets are labeled as Street 1, dividing Complex 1 from Complex 2, and Street 2, dividing Complex 2 from Complex 3. Additional, more narrow streets divided buildings in individual complexes. For example, in Complex 2, Street 5 was oriented west-east and divided Building 2 from Building 5, providing access to larger Street 2. And you can see it here in purple, connected to the main street number 2. So this is street I'm talking about at the very moment here. In Complex 3, Street 3 was also oriented west-east and divided Building 3 from Building 6, providing access to Street 2. Another such west-east oriented street was one labeled as Street 4. It divided Buildings 6 and 7 and was also providing access to larger Street 2. These side streets were approximately 1.4 meters wide. So I would like you to remember that the bright streets, the main streets, you can see here, this one and this one, dividing the three complexes, were 3.2 meters wide, whereas the side streets here, within individual complexes, were 1,4 meters wide. And this is very important for some of the arguments I will make next. All of these streets were made of muddy sandy layers beaten up through continuous use. So of course you cannot imagine any concrete or plastering at that time. So a closer examination of the field documentation and the area plan reveals that street-side mud brick benches are located along two main long and wide streets, labeled as Street 1 and Street 2. I have marked the location of these mud brick benches with red dots. And as you can see here, they concentrate in these long and wide main streets dividing the three complexes. These benches range from 45 centimeters to almost 4 meters in length and are 40 to 60 centimeters in width, meaning that several people could have been seated on them at once, depending on their size. What might they have been doing there? As we have seen, ancient Egyptian textual sources from different periods of ancient Egyptian history indicate that street activities included shaving, wandering around, gossiping, eating, among other things. Most of these activities are most easily done while seated. The distribution of various classes of small finds, including anthropomorphic and zoomorphic figurines, bone buttons, as well as stone artifacts such as grinding stones, faience and clay beads, faience game pieces, faience and stone vessels, as well as stone artifacts such as grinding plates, whetstones, and weaving weights, show that these objects were found both in the houses and along the long streets, Street 1 and 2. And this is exactly where these benches are located. These artifacts suggest that people brought some of their daily activities into the streets. From the material remains, we can infer that these activities likely included grinding grain, sharpening objects, weaving, but also playing games. Unfortunately, the pottery from the streets has not been published yet, making it impossible to determine whether large water vessels were present there too. In area usually free of Tel Dava, benches are found along long and wide streets, while small finds I already mentioned are significantly more concentrated in the same streets than in the narrow or side streets. There is, of course, a logical explanation for this. Placing benches in narrow streets would create congestion, especially if people gather there to sit and engage in various activities. Another settlement site in Lower Egypt that features street-side benches is Abu Ghalib, located approximately 50 kilometers northwest of Cairo, namely here. The site was first identified by Austrian Egyptologist Hermann Juncker during his West Delta expedition in 1928. It was subsequently excavated by a Swedish team between 1931 and 1937, initially led by Per Lugn and later by Hjalmar Larsen. Finds from the site indicate that the settlement dates to the early Middle Kingdom, and the area excavated between 1934 and 1937 covered approximately 1,200 square meters, so less than Tel Dava we have previously seen. And the excavated area included 7 north-south oriented house units, and the site plan reveals 2 identifiable streets, namely here and here. So one street running north-south separated building 2 from buildings 3 and 5. It was about 2 meters wide and 12 meters long, ending in a dead end. At its northmost section, just outside Building 5, an oven was discovered, suggesting that cooking activities also took place outdoors, possibly confirming a long continuation of a practice much later attested in the writings of Herodotus we have already seen. Another street ran west-east, separating Building 1 and 2. Both streets provided access to an open area, measuring approximately 100 square meters, where another oven was located, further indicating that communal or outdoor cooking was part of daily life in the settlement. The location of both ovens you can see here marked in red, in the north-south running street and the open area south of it, is interesting for the following reason. One 4.5 long and 1.3 meter bright mud brick bench was built against the south wall of the building 3, and it is marked here in blue. The bench was 25 centimeters high. You can also see the photo of this bench from the south in the upper right corner of the slide. In fact, the bench is placed not far from an oven. Another small bench was built against the same building at the street corner, here. This small bench was 80 centimeters wide and 1 meter long. Clearly, the people who used the larger bench would be seated in such a way, allowing them to view the activities in the open area with an oven in front of them. They would also be able to see the street to the west and monitor the access to the dead-end street on the corner. In the area of the oven, pottery was found. Among the published vessels are flasks made in Nile V clay. They were around 30 centimeters tall and were used for liquids such as water or beer. The next site I would like to quickly turn to is the island of Elephantine in Upper Egypt, located just across the modern town of Aswan on the first cataract on the Nile. The site has been investigated by a number of researchers. However, the excavations of the ancient town were conducted by the Cairo branch of the German Archaeological Institute and the Swiss Institute for Egyptian Architecture and Antiquities in Cairo. The examples of Elephantine streets I will show date to the Middle Kingdom and were published by the director of the Swiss Institute, Cornelius von Pilgrim. The streets of Middle Kingdom town of Elephantine were 1.5 to 2 meters wide. Thus, they did not allow activities which would cause crowding, something similar to the side streets which we have already seen in Tel Adab. As the excavator and publisher von Pilgrim himself notes, not more than a few people could walk past each other at the same time in these narrow alleys. It comes as no surprise that street-side mud brick benches are found at corners where the streets meet. One such bench was attached to the northeast corner of House 25A of the early Dynasty 12. This one was about 2 meters long and 60 centimeters wide. Another was attached to the House 90, located here on the right of the slide. And this was a bench which was about 2 meters long and 50 centimeters wide. Both benches could have seated several people. If one thinks about the positioning of these benches from the point of view of what one could see while seated on them, one can make an interesting observation. In the first case, the people seated on the bench would have the view of several streets. In the second case, the people seated on the bench would have the view of the entire street in front of them. If we think about this from the point of view of activities attested in written sources, we can imagine that those seated on the benches would know who was wandering from street to street, whose children were out gossiping, and which women were engaged in some not so accepted activities outside. So, all of the examples I have provided indicate that in so-called organically grown settlements, various objects could be found on the streets, including mud brick benches, ovens, grinding stones, pottery vessels, anthropomorphic and zoomorphic figurines, faience beads, bone buttons, copper pins, and gaming pieces. This suggests that the inhabitants of these settlements clearly spent time on the streets engaging in activities such as food processing, cooking, and playing games. As textual sources indicate, they may have also shaved or gossiped while doing so. Thus, streets were not only passageways for moving through the settlement, but also spaces where people carried out domestic activities, socialized, and had fun with their neighbors. This aligns with what André Goertz wrote about labor in pre-capitalist societies. In such societies, domestic activities and certain forms of labor were often intertwined with leisure. This does not mean that all streets were used in all ancient Egyptian settlements in this manner. Namely, in the so-called planned settlements, streets were narrower and divided different building blocks in a regular manner. The example you see here is from Lower Egyptian settlement in Lahun, dating to the Middle Kingdom. The site was excavated by Petrie in 1889 to 1890, and later on by Ludwig Borchardt in 1899. From 1989 to 1997, the site was excavated by Nicholas Millet, and the most recent work was conducted by Zoltan Horvat, whose team started working there in 2008. 10 narrow west-east side streets separated 11 building blocks of the workers' settlement. All 10 side streets were connected to one north-south main street, which connected all building blocks. This type of organization is known as the orthogonal street grid. Unlike in the case of previously mentioned settlements, the quality of the archaeological documentation here does not allow us to closely investigate the activities which could have taken place on these particular streets. However, as argued by previous scholars, the high density and the narrowness of these streets may have conveyed a feeling of a bureaucratic control and restricted circulation, which is of course logical if we consider that these are planned settlements built by the Egyptian government to house the workmen for different large-scale projects such as pyramid and temple building or city constructions. Another example of a planned worker settlement is the original settlement of Tel Adaba we have previously seen. It was excavated in area F1, and the settlement has been dated to the early Middle Kingdom. The excavated area covered around 1,000 square meters. This settlement was characterized by its organized layout, with individual houses arranged in rows. Each house had a surface of only 27 square meters. Something like an average student apartment in New York. Indicating a compact and standardized design, likely intended for labor force. The streets of the settlement were also organized as an orthogonal grid, and the houses were too small to accommodate all the daily activities. It is thus not surprising that the inhabitants of this settlement quickly started to change the design of the settlement and the original layout, expanding their houses on the costs of the streets. So So last but not least, I would like to mention the worker settlement in Tel El Amarna, a mid-18th dynasty site in Middle Egypt, founded as part of the new Archaeology by Pharaoh Akhenaten. Workers' settlement was served by already mentioned Petrie in 1890s and then by Egypt Exploration Society in 1921 under the direction of Eric Peet and Leonard Woolley, and then in 1979 Berry-Kemp resumed the excavations and concluded them in 1986. Here too we find narrow streets dividing building blocks where the workers were housed. In total, 5 streets separate 6 building blocks, all of which are connected to an open area. Although the quality of archaeological documentation here is not as good as in Tel Daba, considering when the site was originally excavated, it is still possible to observe that over time the workers living in this settlement modified the street space according to their own needs, much like the workers in area F1 of Tel Daba. I marked the locations on the plan of the settlement where one can see that houses expanded on the cost of the streets through addition of the divisions. This resulted in shortening the length of the streets, however, the overall layout remained unchanged. So the fact that streets could be used for various domestic activities, labor and leisure, and the fact that they could have been altered to suit the needs of the settlement inhabitants clearly indicates that streets were more than in-between spaces. However, until now, all of the examples I have shown provide a top-down bird's perspective on these settlements. Ancient Egyptians did not experience their settlements and streets in this way. Instead, they experienced the streets like we do, in walking through them, using them, and spending time on them. In the rest of my presentation, I will move from the ocular-centric approach to ancient Egyptian streets and investigate whether or not the ethnographic record of modern villages in rural Egypt can help us to better understand ancient Egyptian streets from a street-level perspective. Previously, we looked at the plan of the workers' settlement at Amarna. However, part of the field documentation from the early excavations includes photographs of early 20th century Egyptian men and women standing between these mud brick walls of the ancient Egyptian settlement. As you can see in the photo in the lower right corner, only a few people would stand next to each other in the narrow streets of ancient workers' settlement, highlighting the cramped living conditions in such settlements. And this is exactly what is indicated by the archaeological record, as I have previously shown. The early 20th century ethnographic classic by Winifred Blackman also describes the use of streets in rural Egypt. So this is this publication here on the left. During that time, streets in rural areas were used not only for the disposal of garbage, but also for activities such as buying and selling, tattooing, and even cursing people. Later studies by Dieter Eigner at Esbet Meesin and Esbet Mahali in the Eastern Delta, so the place where Tel Daba was located, but also those of Nessim Henein at Marigirges and Jacques Rivenel at Balat, further emphasized the use of streets as extensions of their houses, highlighting the social and functional aspects of the streets in everyday life. One account that cannot be classified as ethnographic in the proper sense is provided by the Egyptian architect Hassan Fatih, who in 1973 described his experience of a rural street in Upper Egypt. This account should be read critically, especially given the author's middle-class background, which influenced his perspective, as you can see from the quote on the slide. I have highlighted the aspects of the street that Fatih encountered, leaving out his judgmental comments. So, Fatih describes narrow streets, mud and filth, garbage, dirty water, fish scales, rotting vegetables and offal, with flies present throughout. His portrayal of these streets offers an insight into the conditions he observed, but his interpretation reflects also his own social-cultural biases, which could be considered or have to be considered when analyzing his account. My own walk through the Nubian village on Elephantine Island was an eye-opening experience for understanding the use of streets as space in ancient Egypt. I regularly walked through these narrow streets as I lived in one of the houses for several months as a student from 2013 to 2017. During this time, I also participated in the salvage excavations of the Aswan area directed by Wolfgang Müller of the Swiss Institute in Cairo. However, it was only when I started researching ancient Egyptian streets that I realized how much our bird's eye perspective, or top-down on ancient Egyptian settlement, clouds our attempts to explore streets as more than just in-between spaces. The houses of the Nubian village in Elephantine are made of both concrete and mud brick, yet some are several stories high, much taller than ancient Egyptian houses would have been. Certain similarities to ancient settlements cannot be denied, however. Some streets in Nubian village are narrower than others, and while some have benches, others do not. Certain areas are used for throwing out garbage. The streets that are regularly used by the inhabitants are dusty, but they are watered regularly to prevent the dry dust from rising. The streets are busiest after noon and in the evening when the sun is lower and the weather conditions are more pleasant. This is when adults gather to gossip on the benches and children are going out to play. This is also because they came back from school. Bearing this in mind, I wonder if the anthropomorphic and zoomorphic clay figurines found in the streets of Tel el-Dabba could have been used by children. This ethnoarchaeological account indicates that the use of street space depends on the time of the day, and this temporal component is often overlooked in archaeological perspectives that rely on static settlement plans. In March this year, Steve Harvey, a colleague Egyptologist and a New Yorker, kindly sent me the photos of the streets of the Bassal Island village north of Komombo in Upper Egypt. The upper left photo shows a wooden boat left on the street. Did they use boats on the streets? No, not really. When Harvey asked the inhabitants why they left it there, they responded that it belongs to no one. This reminds us not only that streets are communal spaces, but also that no single inhabitant claims ownership over them. Furthermore, the boat on the photo reminds us of things made of organic materials which are rarely preserved in archaeology. The photo in the middle shows the peculiar slope of the streets in the settlement, something also attested in archaeology. The one in the lower right corner shows a bench running along the exterior wall of the house and being in the shade of the surrounding buildings. These photos also nicely show that the streets were made of muddy sandy layers beaten up after continuous use, just like in the pharaonic period. So I would thus like to stress that some traditional Egyptological approaches, which rely heavily on written sources, tend to use these texts as evidence for activities and then project these texts onto the archaeological record in a top-down manner. What I propose, and what I will continue to explore in my ongoing research on ancient Egyptian streets, is a relational perspective that treats both the archaeological record and the textual sources as data of equal importance. These data are different and can help us to reconstruct various ancient activities from the bottom up. However, our relational perspective also means that our reconstructions must be continuously tested and refined based on the new data. This also concerned ethnographic analogies. Since the examples of modern villages in Egypt I have shown are millennia apart from the archaeological remains I examined. My point is that we should not assume that the streets have been used in the same manner for millennia without the analysis. So, in conclusion, I hope to have demonstrated that ancient Egyptian streets were more than just an in-between space used for moving to the settlements. Textual sources, the archaeological record, ethnography of rural Egypt, and my own ethnoarchaeological observations indicate that streets were dynamic spaces. There is still much more research to be done to understand them better. In this lecture, I could not cover the streets of the first millennium BCE and first centuries of the Common Era due to time constraints. I intend to expand my research into the future and deal with these later streets in order to investigate whether or not there is a continuity in the range of activities I have discussed tonight. On this slide of my presentation, you can see two equally problematic reconstructions of a generic ancient Egyptian street. On the left is a drawing by Egyptian Egyptologist Alexander Badawi. Although it shows people on the streets, finally, it does not illustrate activities other than walking. The benches are missing, and so are ovens and other elements. The reconstruction on the right is my own AI visual experiment in Canva, equally bad. I asked the software to include mud brick benches, seated men and women, people walking, things on the streets, and even dogs, as there are some archaeozoological evidence for their presence in ancient Egyptian streets. However, the buildings appear as though they were built from stone, and the people are not dressed as ancient Egyptians. So I'm nevertheless optimistic that archaeology can in the future, with the right data set, use AI to produce more informed reconstructions and even virtual experiences which could help us to move away from a top-down perspective and come to a lived perspective or the street side level view of ancient Egyptian streets. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
We have time for questions. Anybody would like to? Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. So the widest one I've shown at the beginning of the lecture was 3.2 meters. So you can see, of course, the issues with the AI, that when you feed it with data, it is still not able to produce what we archaeologists expect it to produce.
So really that street would have been much more narrow.
Exactly. So we have to imagine it, well, more or less 1 meter cut back to the left or right, wherever you like.
Wonderful image.
It is a wonderful image, but it's completely useless. From an Egyptological point of view. I always use it only as an illustration of the limits of current AI, because I think, as you correctly noticed, people tend to rely too much on AI, yet they forget that the AI is working with a set of data we provided it, or it looks for itself, And much of the evidence I presented tonight is not accessed by the AI software for now.
You have a question?
Yes, in the other picture, the drawing, are those oven release places for smoke to release from ovens below?
Are you referring to these?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so if you look at this reconstruction a bit more closely, you will notice a very interesting thing, that the reconstruction is based on models of ancient Egyptian buildings. Because, of course, as you can imagine, none of these houses were open in this manner, so that there was like a balcony or a veranda looking like this. So what the author did, he simply used these open models made out of wood or clay, used for completely different purposes, and then put them in a drawing form here to kind of reconstruct the settlement. And there you find all sorts of architecture, elements, furniture, and so on, which you do not find in an ancient Egyptian settlement in this form. And also note, this one here at the back is a so-called tower house of the late period. So it is not contemporary with the models he used for the rest of the houses. Nevertheless, I have to say, for someone who did this in 1966, when settlement archaeology was first kind of appearing in archaeology of Egypt and becoming more and more important and present, this type of a reconstruction has to be welcomed, because he's one of the first people who thought about actually putting people on the streets, populating these settlements. Yeah. Compared to what I've shown, to top-down perspective of a settlement plan, we cannot see people, because the focus
It comes
is
alive.
It comes alive more, this is true. Yeah.
Uroš, and then Joseph after. I'm curious, I just want to make sure I've got this straight in my head. The ovens on the street, they were communal ovens?
This is my view of them. I will tell you why. So if we go back here, you will notice that ovens are located...
Sorry, I couldn't go back.
I could.
Yeah.
You see the problems with AI. So coming back to the oven question, as you can notice here, ovens marked here with a bow are also found inside of the houses. So of course, when they are found inside of the houses, they belong to the household. Whether or not you're going to identify a household with a family, it's a different question, but it's something used privately by people who own or use this building. However, when you have something like this, located in an open area between several of these buildings, then it's either public in broadest sense or public in a more narrow sense, meaning used by inhabitants of several of these buildings. So several households sharing. And again, I have to stress, using modern analogies is very problematic, but we have to work with something. This is very well attested in modern rural Egypt, that several households are sometimes using either communal ovens for baking bread or communal fireplaces.
Which would also imply that there's communal maintenance of them.
Yes, and that's why I think that there's a reason this huge bench was placed here. Because if you think about the location of the bench, it gives you the view of the entire area, and if you turn around the corner, you can see who came out or came into this street, and then also this one here. So it's like a modern surveillance system,
Yeah.
just differently materialized.
Joe, you had a question?
Yes. So, of course, we're talking about a vast region in many centuries, but in terms of the material they used to build their houses and the climate, that because it's Egypt, it would be more a relief to stay inside, or to be outside, because what would incentivize to live more in the street is that if it's cooler in the street rather than inside, that would incentivize living in the street or not. And when you show the map with the streets going east-west, normally that's in order to provide more light, because that's the direction of the sun. So I was just wondering, because it's Egypt, it's normally hot, so you would imagine that if houses are not fresh, people would find relief in the street. So there is any reference to that? Or
absolutely, I agree with you entirely. This is also why I put an emphasis in this last part of the presentation on the ethnographic record, because I saw this with my own eyes. Of course, the people live in mud brick houses, but they tend to stay inside when the sun is hot and high and burning, and it's quite hot there in Assam region. So I will tell you, when it's like beginning of April, you can already count with 40, 45 during the day. So we started work at 5 o'clock in the morning. So I was waking up at 4 so that we can finish until 11 and then continue working in the house because the sun is strong. So the moment the sun would start going down, we would all, of course, go outside of
because
the house.
That's the tendency, right? If you have to stay at home, then at some point you can wait to go outside.
Exactly.
And you must have something to do in the street
Exactly.
once you go out. So,
Exactly. And
okay. So it makes sense. Like
yes.
Okay.
And I think there is also one more aspect we have to consider, but I could not put everything, of course, in this presentation in an hour. There is some both ethnographic and archaeological research done on the effect of cooking smoke on the health of women. So, for example, our colleagues in British prehistory are considering ethnographic data from sub-Saharan Africa, where they could see how women, since the duty of cooking in this gender system falls on them, they are the ones who spend more time next to the ovens getting smoke and inhaling the smoke. Therefore, this affects their health drastically and even causes early death. So, our colleagues from British prehistory are then using these analogies to interpret the state of health of women in Bronze Age Britain. Why am I saying this? Because I have, of course, colleague Egyptologists here in the audience. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not sure that Egyptologists have really considered the impact of cooking smoke in houses, in closed settlement areas, on the on the life of women. And we could maybe think in this direction. So I just, before coming here, I gave another ARCE lecture at the New England chapter at Harvard University, and then I had the possibility to go to MIT Museum. And they have a lovely project at the MIT Institute. They are working in several African communities on how to change the fuel burned by these women during cooking, so that although they smoke themselves because they have to cook, they don't get intoxicated. So one of the solutions to this is getting people outside of the households in open areas so that the smoke disperses. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
I have a question. The ovens, were they only used for cooking, or were they also used for firing pots and other cooking implements? And could it not be, since you have two ovens there, one is outside, one is inside, so one oven could be like a summer oven when it was so hot, and in the winter, one would be a winter oven, and it would belong to the same building structure.
Thank you. I like your consideration of
It's like barbecuing today.
Yeah, I like your idea of different ovens existing simultaneously but not being used at the same time. So this I will definitely consider. However, these are definitely like cooking ovens. Why? Because pottery kilns look differently in ancient Egypt. They're bigger, they're deeper, and there's all sorts of technological evidence which we are lacking here. So this is definitely like a domestic oven.
And I have another question about the benches.
Yes.
Some of the benches are very long.
Yes.
Could it not be that some of those benches were also used to sell wares on the street, you know, textiles and other kinds of goods that maybe relate to the building that the bench is associated with?
I like this suggestion. Why? Because if you look at this in the background, you can imagine that sometimes you can span like a canopy over out of textile or whatever material, especially in a more narrow street. So, you know, if you think about 3 meters, it sounds huge, but it's actually not such a big space, so this is doable. And then when you have such a big bench, of course, you can use it as a kind of outdoor bazaar or souk area. And again, I dare making these modern analogies. Everyone who's been to Egypt to a souk or bazaar, these streets used for vendors are also covered so that the light does not go in or the sun is not hitting hard, but also the goods remain fresh. So I agree with you entirely on that. It's a very good suggestion.
Thank you. It was an excellent presentation, very suggestive a lot of things. Could you put this a little bit more in a comparative perspective? As I began to watch your slides and especially the schematic of the cities, so immediately popped into my mind, for example, the Mayan New World and how they set things up with little local areas and plazas, etc. Of course, you think of the entire Mediterranean with piazzas and plazas, etc. And while in some of the later ones I saw some of that open area in sense, but a lot of it I didn't. And so I'm kind of curious, do you have any comments from that comparative perspective?
I have to say that this is an excellent, challenging question. And it has been dealt not only by me, but also by a range of Egyptologists, and I think there is no consensus on that. So if you think about ancient Egyptian settlements from a comparative perspective, what we notice is exactly the lack of this central area like a communal plaza or something like that. So there are some examples of this. So I will show the one dear to me, and this is Tel Daba area F1, because there we know the entire size of the settlement. Sorry, I think I went too far. Yeah, so if you look at this settlement over here, so this was a planned settlement of the early Middle Kingdom. This is the one with rather small houses, so 27 square meters, and you see they are all in this orthogonal grid. The streets are quite narrow, and there is like what archaeologists think, in comparison to other settlements where this is better known, there is kind of a control building here. And this is very important because someone there was monitoring the activities here. And then you have this open area. And now, you can say this open area can be used for exactly what we just discussed, domestic activities, communal spaces, and so on. But don't forget, this is a planned settlement for workmen who were tightly and highly controlled by the Egyptian government. We have evidence from the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom that those workmen or local village big men who didn't manage to collect enough resources to give to the Egyptian government would be publicly punished by beating. So it's very hard to interpret such spaces. I'm I'm wondering whether what we think is an open area for kumbaya activities is actually something more sinister, where the entire community can observe what happens to the one in charge if he does not meet his duties. It's only a suggestion, but I think it has to be considered. Why? Because the same thing is attested in Lahun, also worker settlement of the Middle Kingdom, and then later on in Amarna.
I mean, the specialization of the particular sites which are set up like Lahun, I mean, the purpose why they were set up really does matter.
Exactly.
No question.
Exactly.
And then the thing that obviously comes through to me is partly that, what does it say about the nature of social relations in the sense of the families and the community and the rest of it. And I will just say, having worked in various parts of the world, I mean, especially in warmer weather, I mean, outdoor life is just what it is. I mean, it's all the time.
Well, thank you for this comment. And I have to say that you hit the nail on the head when you said that the organization of the community also influences the activities and the outlook of the settlement. So if we go back to the first example I showed, which is this organic settlement in Tel el-Daba, I have to stress another problem we have in archaeology of Egypt. Not all of these settlements were excavated in entirety. So for example, this is only a fragment. So we know that these streets continue, but we don't know how long. And we also don't know if maybe you are right, and there is some kind of a central plaza somewhere here or there. But in our defense, here we also have a geomagnetic image. So we can compare the excavated archaeological record to what the geomagnetic image is telling us what is underground. And so far, no such central areas. So far.
We have time for one more question.
How much, so you talked about how there was a book about like Roman streets.
Mm-hmm.
How much can we use like studies on other civilizations and what their citizens did in the street or in between spaces to apply to Egypt? Because some of the things you listed are kind of like just parts of human nature. So how much, you know, from ancient Greece or Mesopotamia can we use in trying to figure out what people were doing in these spaces?
That's an excellent question, thank you. So an answer to that would be, when I'm applying the models based on studies of ancient Roman streets, I'm not trying to copy-paste what we have in these works onto ancient Egypt. I'm trying to get inspired by theory and methodology of ancient Roman street studies. For example, there is something called space syntax analysis, and this is only rarely used in Egyptology, I think only by a few colleagues. Whereas in Roman settlement archaeology concerning use of street space syntax analysis have been used since late 80s and 90s. So when I say comparison to, I mean comparison to theory and methodology used by these scholars and not transferring the data itself. If we, by any chance, come to the same conclusion, then yes, why not? For example, as I said, shaving was also something done on ancient Roman streets, also only for men, not for women. And this is again interesting, as you said, from a point of view of a comparison. What does that tell us about different human societies? I would avoid saying that it tells us about human nature, but in this context I would say it tells us more about how certain gender systems allow men to be shaved in public or, you know, cosmetically treated in public, showing their bodies in public, whereas women are not supposed to be doing that in public. And if you think about Roman streets, there is entire discourse about appropriate behavior and how women are not supposed to show their bodies outside. And this is something we also find in Egypt. So this is, in my opinion, less human nature and more a gender system we call patriarchy. Not a natural thing.
We're going to wrap up now, but conversation can continue downstairs if you'd like to join us. applause for a marvelous